Hello, hello, hello. We are back with another video here. Today is a pretty interesting one. We have two persons. We have Dyer, who is kind of a C-list YouTuber. He is a Orthodox Christian. He makes good logical arguments and kind of gets into debates. He's kind of a debate bro, making debates for Christianity and theism in general. And on the other side, we have Jake Newman, who's kind of a skeptic. He likes investigating weird topics, and he isn't an atheist per se because I think he's a pro-theist. So he thinks religion in general is good, but he's also a skeptic. So we're gonna listen to Jay Dyer. Get into it.
I agree with you that there's a lot of value to be gained in practicing religion. I think we live in a world where it's difficult to create a system of morality and ethics outside of religion, and there's a lot of value to religion, okay? I think people should practice what they want to practice. That being said, I still think it's appropriate to say, well, hold on a minute, did the stories of the Bible actually happen? But again, I want to make it extremely clear to the listeners. I'm not saying this is so silly you shouldn't practice religion. I'm saying there's value to religion, and it's a good question to ask, how do you know the stories happened? And I think you can be someone who practices religion or appreciates religion, but doesn't believe in the Bible word for word. So really my question is just, how do you know that the Bible, like the stories of the Bible, actually?
All right, I'm just gonna pause there, and I'm gonna phrase what he's saying. He's basically saying religion is a nice idea. I think it's good, but I personally don't hold any supernatural or theistic beliefs myself. It's a great idea. People should practice their religion, religion. However, I'm a skeptic. And this is all fine, well, and good until you start getting into okay, well, then, if you don't have a religious perspective, how do you ground your knowledge? How do you structure your epistemology? How do you order your beliefs in the world if not through a religious top-down perspective? And I haven't heard many atheists come up with good answers. Most atheists are like, "Oh, just empiricism, or it works," pragmatism, which they don't. They're not a fully encompassing, completely sound structure for understanding the world. Because what happens when your pragmatism stops working, or when your senses lie to you? You don't really have a fallback structure to rely on if one of these systems failed. So, but let's get into it.
Actually happened? That's my question.
Yeah, it's a fair question. I tend to argue the transcendental argument for God's existence, and so it's kind of like it's a logical argument that's prior to logic at all, or the doing of logic, or any knowledge claims at all, because it deals with the preconditions of knowledge. So it's kind of like I would agree with you that we're not going to settle the issue of like what things are possible or not possible apart from what types of things we think are possible within our worldviews or our paradigms. So ultimately, for me, it's kind of a worldview question where we end up saying, well, the only way that I know what's possible is based on some kind of metaphysical assumption from the outset. And in order to go about that, we end up having to do worldview or transcendental argumentation. So that's kind of debating things at a fundamental level. And the challenge is this, that if the Christian God does not exist, then knowledge, metaphysics, and ethics becomes impossible to justify or make sense of.
Yeah. So to kind of simplify what he's saying, it's a fairly complex argument, but you can, you can make it pretty simple. All he's really saying is, how do we ground our knowledge? Basically saying, how do you know to trust your senses, and how can you make truth claims? How can you make assertions? How can you prove something to be true, more than just a hallucination, or more than just a normative claim, or something, based off your senses? He's saying, well, how do you structure your knowledge? And then he says, well, I use God as an external metaphysical source to kind of ground our knowledge. And then it gives you, that unlocks access to a bunch of different useful logical and other things that he's going to get into here.
So I usually flip this argument and say that the way that I know is that without that God existing, knowledge in terms of justified true belief wouldn't really even be possible. And so God becomes, for me, in my argument, the necessary grounding for the possibility of knowledge, logic, ethics at all. That's the
which is fine. And here's kind of the thing you have to understand about logical frameworks, I think, is once you start getting into these very complex arguments and you start looking at different arguments for God, arguments for knowledge, forms of epistemology and metaphysics, you start to realize that no logical argument is completely soundproof. There's no like one correct argument, right? It's not like you have 8 different options and you just gotta sort through which one has the right answer. That's not really how it goes. It's more like you're trying to create a system, a structure that is sound and doesn't have contradictions. That's kind of what and explains the most things possible. So like the reason that an argument from like a transcendental argument for God's existence is probably better than what most atheists are capable of coming up with is because it's grounded and it's structured. It starts with God. God then creates the world, which has logic and order. And then that order, we can make observations. And using the tool of logic given by God, we can then make conclusions. And we can start using logic to have things like truth and knowledge and beliefs. And it's structured soundly. So in my opinion, you don't even necessarily need it to be the Christian God. It doesn't necessarily follow. The only reason you would maybe start looking at the Christian God over other gods is because you would then start diving into the historical and factual accounts that we have in reality about God. And then, because once you assert God, after that, that's a completely fine logical structure you can use. But then once you start diving into the nitty-gritty, basically the facts of reality, you go, okay, well, let's check the Bible, let's check the Quran. Now you can start delving into the texts and what people to believe to be divinely inspired. And then it's really just a competition of whose text and whose scripture crumbles first. Which one contradicts itself the most? Like, which one fits seamlessly into what we know about the scriptures? Like, one reason the Quran kind of falls apart, in my opinion, is because it doesn't do a very good job at explaining Jesus in general. They just label him as a prophet, and they don't have an explanation for all the different prophecies of the Jewish text that he fulfilled. So they just kind of label him a prophet. They don't have very in-deep arguments for how he was able to fulfill all of these prophecies and what, he's just some prophet. So yeah, but I'm not going to get into the deep and very controversial arguments of different types of religion. He's merely arguing from how do we know that religion exists? That's really where he's at. So he's going to school this Jake Newman guy.
Transcendental argument, and I think it's the strongest one.
By the way, I want to... the other thing, like, I feel like I could have done better in my conversation with Jonathan Peugeot is, like, I want to concede to as many points as I possibly can, because that way I don't detract. I really have one singular point, and I don't want it to get lost. And I feel like with religious debate and conversation, you know, the arguments often they get tangled up because there's so many layers of understanding that we can get to with these conversations. So let me concede as much as I can. You know, you're making, so God exists, right? I have no problem with that. Why not? So God is, let's say God is real, and you know, and that explains, I think, whatever you were saying about like the ethics or something. So again, let me ask the question: how do you know that the stories of the Bible actually happened?
Because of the transcendental argument. That's where I start from.
So I don't know if I followed the argument, but I think what your argument is saying is like because of...
Yeah, okay, let me recap just in case the audience is also a little lost. He's basically saying, how do we justify knowledge? We need a solid structure of epistemology to assert things in general. Otherwise, you have to go down the rabbit hole of skepticism, which eventually leads to absurdism and total skepticism and Kant and Hume kind of ridiculousness. You can do that. That's also technically a sound structure. It just doesn't answer anything. It's like trying to play chess, except you don't have a chessboard. You can try. You're not going to get very far. I don't know how structured of a game you can have without a chessboard, but you can try. So it's actually more legitimate than halfway, which is like empiricism or pragmatism, or there's some weird ones where they basically just, it's like all they do is they make normative claims. They're like, well, I know I exist, and I know the sky exists, and I know blah blah blah. They just point out facts about the real world, with no actual grounding for any of it. And then yeah, so basically he's like, okay, how do we create a structure? My structure is God. So God sits at the top. He gives us everything else. Okay, great. And then from then, it's like, well, what God do you choose? Well, if we look at the text, then it looks like the Christian God is the most reliable. That seems to be the argument, I would guess, J. Dyer has. He didn't quite say it out directly. But that, I think I think that's his position.
Some things that we see in the world, like, I don't know, like patterns or something, that therefore I'm not following. Like, what's the argument?
So the form of the argument is X is a necessary condition of Y therefore X. The argument in terms of how I explicate it is that if God didn't exist, then there would be no way to have justified true belief. That is, a way to ground our knowledge in terms of epistemology. And so because we do have knowledge, or we appear to, exchange information and have conversations, and we use language and meaning and numbers and math and all that, then knowledge appears to exist. And so therefore, in order for knowledge to even be possible, requires some kind of ultimate absolute, some kind of ultimate principle, and namely that is the Christian God.
So yeah, like, okay, what's my interpretation or what's my perspective? Which all of this is perfectly sound. He just asserts God as the source of all this. I don't even think you need to say God exists. You don't have to. You could just say my divine force that gives provides epistemology and justification for truth, knowledge, language, meaning, beliefs. You could just say some divine force that gives the universe structure, right? As long as you have a structure of the universe, everything else follows. Because logic, what is logic really? Logic is a reflection of the structure of the universe, right? The reason logic works and is consistent, and X is a precondition for Y and it must follow, is because in the universe, if X thing happens, like say you drop a ball, then Y must happen, which is that the ball will fall. So really logic is a reflection, a mirroring of reality. So all you need is to say reality has a defined structure, and then you can use whatever figurehead or use whatever source you want for that. And I mean, why not use the Christian God? Like, there's no reason you can, there's no reason you can't. And yeah, but I don't even think you need to say that there's a God. You just need to say that there is a force, or you can just assert that the universe has structure. You can just say my epistemology is the innate structure and foundation of the universe, which is that it follows a set of rules, and those rules don't deviate.
Christian God does the work of grounding as a kind of in theology is called divine conceptualism. So meaning, language, all these things are only possible in the sense of justifying their existence and their
Jay, maybe I'm fucking stupid. I'm not understanding this at all, man. Let me try to read it back to you, and then you. So the essence of what you're saying is like, look, you're not trying to prove the Bible stories being true from first principles, saying, hey, Jake, look, here's the evidence, here's how I know it's true. What you're doing is the reverse, which I think is a reasonable approach to take, right? To say, like, I want to think of an analogy. Like, if I can't prove something, like, okay, if I find a dead person with a bullet hole in their head and I can't find the gun, I could infer like, hey, this person probably got shot in the head because now there's a bullet hole in their head, right? So it's possible for us to infer causal relationships.
No.
No, it's more fundamental than that. He's making an argument for transcendentalism, and you're talking about like actual fundamentals of our understanding of logic and meaning, and it's a much deeper debate than just a normative logical inference. You know what I mean?
So I don't fault you for
and yeah, this is the general problem I see atheists run into, is they can't go past normative claims. They just keep everything in like, oh, how do I... They think that they can just contain everything in the realm of like empiricism and just using your senses. And it's like, well, how can you trust your senses? And they're like, oh, well, it works. Works according to what? Define works. You know what I mean? It's just, yeah, it's a very dumb, circular, just bad structure. And Jake Newman's doing the same thing, where he's trying to keep it in the realm of just like, well, I just want to know if the stories of the Bible are true or not. And he's making this analogy with like a crime scene. And it's like, well, you can't even really use the analogy of the crime scene because we haven't asserted logic yet. We haven't asserted some basic things. You're just using those tools as if we've already granted them. And it's like, well, no, we have to start from the beginning because you're asking a very fundamental question.
Like, I don't know if it's because I haven't slept enough. Like, so you're saying, can you say your argument in like one sentence? Like, so you think that the essence of what you're saying is you think the stories of the Bible happened because
I can give his argument in one sentence. He's saying, how do you ground knowledge? How do you ground meaning, math, language, justified true beliefs, anything? How do you ground that? How do you know that that's structured? And he's like, oh, and he's just floundering.
Way that they're manifesting themselves in reality. I'm just not clear what you're really saying. Like,
yeah, I mean, right. So again, it's a specific type of logical argument called the transcendental argument for God's existence, right?
Yes.
And it posits that before you can even do the type of questioning that you're asking about what's possible in terms of miracles or Bible stories or whatever, that there are prior questions that we all have and assumptions about what's possible that have to be debated and discussed first. So in your worldview, you would, as a skeptic or an atheist or whatever your position is, agnostic, you would assume that, well, it just doesn't seem like those things are possible. So at the outset, you and I have different accounts of what things are and aren't possible, metaphysically speaking. So the point there is just to say that...
I don't think we do at all. If I told you, hey man, like my grandma rose from the dead today, you'd be like, nah, man, no she didn't. Like, let me see evidence of that. I would bet that you and I, Jay, have the same understanding of what generally is metaphysically possible.
Well, no, but because my ultimate governing commitment is the Christian paradigm, yours is not. So no, we have fundamentally different accounts of what things are and are not possible.
Would you believe me if I told you right now my grandmother rose from the dead?
Isn't that ironic? Because I mean, the entire Christian perspective is that Jesus rose from the dead. That's their entire delineating belief. So it's funny he uses an example of resurrection to try to dissuade the Christian, because that's literally their founding principle, is that Jesus rose from the dead. It's just kind of ironic.
No, it would not.
Why not?
Because it's very unlikely.
Right, because why? Because it violates what you know about physics, right?
No, it's just it wouldn't be likely just given a common sense account of what things typically occur. But
exactly. So
whoa, there's a big difference, and you and the audience need to parse out what he's saying. Basically, Jay Dyer is saying that's a normative claim. That is dealing with things that just occur in the day-to-day, and in the day-to-day, that's probably unlikely. He didn't say impossible. He didn't say that it couldn't be possible, because he believes in miracles. He believes in the existence of a God. So he's saying it could be possible, but he wouldn't outright say that it's impossible. He's just saying it's unlikely, which is a completely... He's basically separating his old argument of the transcendental argument and metaphysics from this. He's saying this isn't really a metaphysical thing. Me saying it's unlikely isn't a metaphysical argument, because it's just dealing with something in the day-to-day.
Yeah,
Just
but
take your words. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you.
So the whole argument, I think you've missed the entire argument. The argument is not settled by particular claims about this or that event in our lives. It's a question of paradigms as a whole. And you're reading everything, all of the evidence that comes into your brain or whatever is read through your worldview, through your paradigm. And so you say your assumption is that certain things are not possible or very, very unlikely. But that has nothing to do with whether or not you can give an account for these things as a whole. So do you believe that there's objective truth or that knowledge is possible?
I don't. You'd have to define those terms. And by the way, I don't want to. I'm not trying to.
He's going to definitions. It's like, yeah, he's not grasping what's at stake here, which is that your worldview has no structure. You just go off your senses, but how you interpret your senses, the necessary framing and organization and parsing out of those senses has a structure. And he's like, what is that structure for you? Because mine is the Christian paradigm. Yours is what, basically?
I don't want to like outright try to refute what you're saying or try to kind of push you to a corner. I really am genuinely trying to understand.
Right. So I mean, we've heard skeptical claims a lot, and I don't have a problem with you bringing forward sort of the skeptical claim or argument, but the point is that this is a much deeper issue than whether or not it's possible for something out of the ordinary to happen. So let's say that your grandmother did appear to, come back or wake up out of the coffin or something like that. I mean, you would probably assume that even if that occurred, it wasn't a miracle. It was some sort of weird phenomenon that we haven't studied or understood yet, or science hasn't given us an answer yet, right? So even if someone rose from the dead, it wouldn't necessarily mean that the supernatural is true, even in your worldview, right?
No, I mean, if someone rose from the dead, I would be a believer, man. I would say, wow, that's pretty good evidence that something's going on here. I would, in that instant, I would try to find a religious.
Well, don't you think that? So there's a lot of claims of this in the world, right? And most skeptics.
Is my mic okay? Can you hear me?
But why? I mean, he makes a good point. Is like, well, okay, but why would you immediately assume the supernatural? Like, what's that based off of? What are your inferences, and what is the meaning of events filtered through? Like, that's kind of the point he's getting at, is like, you can't just use empiricism because your claims about knowledge and meaning, like what's the meaning behind someone rising from the dead? Jay Dyer is saying, well, that means that there's been potentially a supernatural occurrence provided for by God. And then the atheist who doesn't believe in any of that would say, nope, that was just a scientific phenomenon we haven't studied yet. That was a weird fluke. They were pronounced dead by accident. They weren't actually dead. The atheist would assert a worldly explanation, whereas Jake Newman basically has no actual structure to his beliefs. If someone rose from the dead, what? He's just going to flop to theism? Like, it doesn't make any sense.
Okay.
Yeah, I can.
It's like good because I got this Shure microphone. I don't know if it's coming. The audio on Twitter Spaces doesn't really give me an option to.
You sound great to me. So.
Do I?
You sound great, yeah.
Oh, thanks, man. You should see. Okay. So, anyways, you were saying.
This guy.
No, I mean, there are miracle claims all the time in the world, and most people do not accept them. They most of the time they will say, well, there's probably another explanation for that, and you don't think in the case of your grandmother you would look for another explanation?
Yeah, so if I saw it, then I would say, wow, that's pretty remarkable. If I told you my grandmother rose from the dead, hopefully you would not believe me. You would say, dude, I don't believe you. That sounds pretty unlikely.
Well, that's precisely why this issue can't be solved on what people's claims are, and it's a...
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why it goes to the paradigm level. That's the whole point of the transcendental argument.
So let's then... I was saying, I don't understand the transcendental argument. Let's drill into the transcendental argument. So I'm going to say what I understand about it, and then maybe you can elaborate a bit, and we can have a substantive conversation about this argument itself. So the transcendental argument, as I understand from you, is that we understand the divinity of the Bible or of Christianity based on the causes of that source. So based on
No,
what we're
it's
seeing
not the causal argument.
He still doesn't get it. This is really funny.
in reality. So what? So I guess what? Let's just dig into that. So what is it about the world?
Right. So the transcendental argument is prior to the teleological argument. Is prior to the causal argument. It's before all of those, because it's an argument about the possibility of arguing at all. So it's a meta level argument. Are you familiar with like meta level argumentation?
I just think it's. I guess.
Well, maybe you need to understand it first, because I'm not trying to be rude, but like let's understand it first. So, what is your worldview first, by the way? Agnostic?
What is my worldview? I don't know. You know what? I actually, on principle, I'm gonna stay away from any of those terms because I don't think they're helpful in this context. In fact, I think they detract from the point. I think a big problem with these religious arguments is you have people like Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson who, because of their own ego primarily, are kind of rambling and trying to intertwine these complex terms. I'm going to use as simple terms as possible and as few words as...
All right, I'm going to stop it here because I've watched this once before, and basically Jay Dyer just continues to get mad at Jake Newman, and Newman flounders. But yeah, it's an important argument to think about, guys, because if you're an atheist in the chat, if you're just an atheist and you're like, oh, I don't believe God, or you're agnostic, well, you need if you're not going to use God, you need to create your own complex and thorough worldview for interpreting the world. And you can either go the skeptic route and say, no, we can't have knowledge. We can't have justified true beliefs. We can't even have logic. Some people go that far. And then you have to kind of develop your own worldview so that you can not be floundering like this Jake Newman guy over here who doesn't even have a worldview, who doesn't know what to think. He would just flop to theism. He would flop to the Christian God as soon as he sees someone rise from the dead. You don't want to be that guy. So with that, we're going to head out. I'll see everybody later.